afternoon, colleagues. It's such a pleasure to see all of you in the flesh. And I'm so tired of Zoom and IT, Microsoft Teams and so on. So this is a wonderful occasion, and thank you for social distancing. And I hope you're not thinking you're risking anything, but it's great to have you here. I want to say that we're here on the second day of 16 days of activism against violence against women. And I think it's very appropriate that we launch Julie's book on this day. My Science Chair have book launches very often of books that are not in political science. But these books all make a very significant contribution to a body of gender scholarship. So Julie, it's a privilege for me to launch your book today. And why I'm saying it's appropriate in this 16 days of non-violence is because the book is on trauma. And I think if we talk about gender-based violence and sexual violence, then we are a severely traumatized nation. And I think your book contributes to also for us to think through trauma and how do we writing to survive, right? So not only, I think, dealing with trauma through all kinds of therapeutic ways, but writing. And all of us, those of us who are academics, know how important writing is, and very often just to write, to understand what you think and what you feel. So Julie, congratulations with this book. It's a significant milestone, and I think that it's going to make a very important contribution. So this is the book, Writing and Reading to Survive. It's on the table, and it's for sale for 400 Rand today, just today. I'm just kidding. Alphonso is going to be in conversation with Julie, and I want to, before I introduce them both, just read a bit about the book. It's also on the back cover. Writing and Reading to Survive brings a number of trauma narratives from the Hebrew Bible into conversation with contemporary trauma narratives, exploring how these ancient and modern day stories mitigate the experiences of pain and suffering in the face of trauma. Focusing on the intersections between trauma, gender, the trauma narratives selected for this monograph include biblical narratives that have emerged out of major cataclysmic traumatic events that all but destroyed the people of Judah before, during, and in the aftermath of the Babylonian invasion and exile. To read contemporary trauma narratives alongside biblical trauma narratives has the purpose of expanding readers' visions, perhaps introducing them to texts that yield fresh insights into often painful topics associated with women's experience of trauma. So this is what the book is about, and they will talk about it. Before I introduce them, I just also want to welcome Professor Nico Koopman and Professor Reginald, who is on Zoom with us, and other colleagues who are also on Zoom, welcome. Julie Claassens is Professor in Old Testament and Head of the Gender Unit at the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch University. She's the author of this book, and then Claiming Her Dignity, Female Resistance in the Old Testament, 2016, Mourner, Mother, Midwife, Reimagining God's Liberating Presence, 2012, and The God Who Provides Biblical Images of Divine Nourishment, 2004. Her research and teaching interests include trauma hermeneutics, feminist and post-colonial interpretation of the Old Testament. She particularly enjoys engaging students in terms of the contemporary reception of the biblical text, challenging harmful interpretations and opening up interpretations that may be life-giving in nature. Alphonso Groenewald came all the way from Pretoria, thank you for that. Is professor in the Department of Old Testament at University of Pretoria, right? University of Pretoria. Recently has engaged with the new field of trauma theory and biblical studies and its application to the prophetic books, especially the book of Isaiah. Theologians have always engaged with questions of human suffering. This discourse about suffering and God's implied absence is described as the theodicy. Is that?
Theodicy.
Theodicy question. Theodicy engages with claims about the goodness and presence of God during mysterious situations of suffering in the world. The rise of trauma studies and the theological engagement with it can move theology, particularly, and the Old Testament specifically, in new directions. And I think we are in a time of a pandemic. So the untold suffering that the pandemic has brought on the world. So again, I think very timely. It's over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would also like to thank Amanda for this very kind, friendly invitation. And then obviously, Julie, had it not been for your book, I also would not have been here today. And I'm very grateful and honored, not only for our friendship, but also for our collegial working together, engaging on topics of the Hebrew Bible, prophets, etc., etc. I would really like to compliment you for this book. We had a number of conversations last year during your stay in Germany, and you are so prolific and so productive. So I'm so impressed. We were talking a year ago still about the book, and a year thereafter we have the book in our hands. So it's really a privilege for me, and I think I think something like this has never been done before. I mean, a lot has already been written on trauma and trauma theory and application in biblical studies, but in the way that you have engaged with modern day narratives, stories, bringing that in conversation with the Hebrew text is something I think unique. I can still remember, given the fact that we should have been in Boston, well, a few days ago for the SPL and the AIR, but exactly 4 years ago in San Antonio, although we had known each other before that, I wonder whether you can still remember, we went upstairs with the escalators and in a quiet corner we sat down and I started bombarding you with questions about the new discovery for me, trauma theory. Where do I start? What are the basic authors you need to consult? So, and 4 years thereafter, I'm very thankful and proud to be with you in this event. But when I started preparing for this discussion, I actually, in the back of my mind, I remember there was a publication, a journal publication with one of your US colleagues. And in my mind, I thought it was 2013. So I went into my folder, trauma literature, and then when I opened it, I actually discovered 2008. Already you had an article yourself, but you're also the co-editor with your US colleague, David Garber. So it seems for more than 12 years already that you've been engaged in some or another way, not only, but very much engaged in applying trauma theory. So maybe you can give us a little bit of background. Where did this start? So it must have been 2006, 2007, 2008 already. How did your journey start? How did you bump onto trauma theory and its application in biblical studies?
This is such a great question. Before delving into that, just also, Amanda, thank you so much, and all of you and some colleagues who's on Zoom. So thank you. It's a privilege to have you also here. You know, you do, with that question, give away how old I am. So, and I do look younger because I have an 8-year-old who's sitting there. But yes, I've been doing this for a long time. I was then teaching in the United States. I was co-chair of the Theology of Hebrew Scriptures. And one of the joys of being a co-chair is that you can come up with a theme for a Society of Biblical Literature. And I remember I was then working on a chapter for my mourner mother midwife on lamentations and wailing women, and sort of fascinating. I had an article sort of calling the keeners, and in that process I discovered sort of the early buddings of drama theory, because really it's only since then, that's 28, that people first started writing about drama. So we were very excited. We had this panel with Todd Linnefeld and Sam Valentine then, and Daniel Christopher, and Carol Kathleen Connor, who's a hero of us both. And then we got Kathy Carruth to be the respondent which is like a goddess in the field of trauma theory. She's in literature, so nothing with theology, but we borrow from other fields. And it was just such a high point for me, and just what they do and open up. So after that, I wrote became the monograph Mourner, Mother, Midwife, which looks at alternative imagery for God, and sort of the whole notion of lament and how important lament is. And then that morphed into sort of my work in Jeremiah, which is such a big theme of lament also, but also in my 2016 sort of a monograph on claiming her dignity, which is on female resistance in the Old Testament. And my writing is very existential, so a lot of what I experience and also comes into my writing, and in that sense, maybe writing a reason to survive. In that sense, but then also with female resistance, sort of thinking a lot of stories of sexual violence, also Amanda. So very much thinking about that, and also how narratives, together with my colleague Janine van der Walt, who's here, so glad, sort of thinking about how biblical texts serve as and films serve as a reflective surface, sort of trying to change the world, helping to change the world. But sort of using literature and trying to get people to enter story world. And we do it with our students. I do it with my students all the time. And you see how these biblical texts open up a world to them. In the biblical text, in the Hebrew Bible, what happens to them, but also in the contemporary world, their own issues that they are facing. So that was the 2016 project. And then I sort of, when I'm looking into a sabbatical project last year, sort of starting to write on this theme of trauma narratives and biblical trauma narratives, and then starting to bring it into the sort of crazy thing. I've got Crystal Meyer, my host, who might be also tuned in. And remember, I asked her last year in Germany, is this not pushing it too far? Is it not too far? Is it not, even for me, who's sort of pushing boundaries and everything? But I think it might, she's like, no, this is good, go with COVID. So she was also, really encouraging me to do this new thing of bringing biblical narratives in conversation with novels. And I love novels ever since a little girl, loving to read, loving to what it also opens up in the world. But then, and I think in terms of trauma hermeneutics, sort of the contributions, but people haven't done yet in English literature. My colleague Nadia Sanger, also part of our feminist study group, we've had a lot of conversations about trauma theory. So in English literature, in sociology, in psychology, people have really used trauma theorists to such an important part of making sense making in terms of trauma. And in our field, narratives, the trauma narratives, and what Laurie Bicroy and Anne Whitehead and Ronald Granovsky and some of the other figures have brought in, have not really been helping us to read the narratives of the Hebrew Bible. So I thought that was helpful, these conversations that's brought between contemporary trauma novels and then the biblical novels.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe you can say something how did you write the book? The whole process.
In coffee shops in Germany. So people that know me, I see some of my other coffee fellow coffee shop dwellers. So that is where I write. I write in coffee shops and most productive spaces. And I can still, even when I reread this today, I can still remember where I wrote what. So that was an interesting question, because my process, the heart of this book, the kernel, is actually in the last chapter with daughter Zion and which Lamentations, book of Lamentations, that I brought into conversation with Grace. And I wrote an early article actually as part of our we have this partnership with our Dutch partners in Groningen. So we have yearly conferences, and we work on publications. So I wrote actually in this book on human dignity, also on this article conversation between Lamentations and Disgrace. And that became sort of the heart of this. And I actually revisited that article for this book. Totally reworked, added a lot of other material, news. It's so interesting just to see my 20 what was it, 11 article, and now in the book. Sort of interesting to see how you grow, mature, how it takes time to develop. So that, I think that, and then I sort of starting, okay, what novels can I use? It's also, I've been so informed by Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale that I only read like 2 years ago, in 2018 when I read that. No, 2-3 years ago. So I didn't read it. I've not watched the series. I'm not a fan sort of the series, but the book I love. So, and then wrote on that, and then I also found other novels to speak about reproductive loss. Rachel's Cry. Rachel, there's not much on miscarriage, stillbirth in the Hebrew Bible, but at the figure of Rachel. But then found a wonderful book, Light Between the Oceans, which is on reproductive loss, Australian novel, beautifully written, multiple layers of trauma, also on husband and wife and what he does. And that sort of becomes a sounding board, conversation partner to help us imagine Rachel's voice, what she would have said. And then even presenting on that, teaching on that, how many people, students, come to me and say, you know, we never speak about this, but this happened to us. This is my story too. Actually, now just Meghan Markle, she funny, spoke about her own struggle, that very poignant way. So yeah.
So in a certain sense, also your own biography, personal circumstances, personal experiences play a very important role in your own theology, practicing theology.
And reading the Bible. So
you're hermeneutical
lens. Yeah.
And I remember our colleague Tanya, who's also here, introduced me to one of your retired professors, Denise Ackerman. I think it's the something of the Locusts, and where she starts and saying an introduction that you have to practice theology from your biography. You cannot detach it from who you are, from your own life. And I think that's something that's quite important for us as theologians. And I don't want to say we should have our methodologies as well, because we are doing scholarship, but we cannot write as if we don't bring our own biography into our own.
See why I'm friends with him. So it's like, yes, and I mean, for all the feminists in the room will tell you the personal's political, and the political's personal. We are this become this. We embody it. We use our bodies. We feel it. We live it. We come out of that. I mean, it's sort of, but it's also in terms of biblical scholarship. I mean, in terms of now, for those of you not in theology, I mean, very much in terms of hermeneutics. We read, we come to the Bible, we come to a text with a certain lens. And in our field, the fights are between those who say, oh, the objective truth, scientific truth, you know, sort of you can be objective, but you can't, because you always come with who you are, what you see in the text. And I mean, sort of race matters, gender matters, sexual orientation matters, class matters, poverty matters, everything matters in how we read the text. And so that's sort of where what I teach, what I write, falls into what you would say, criticism, reading the biblical text through feminist, post-colonial, queer, masculinity studies, disability. Also, yeah, so I write like that, I teach like that.
I think the intersectionality of gender and trauma, I think that's a major contribution.
Yeah. And I mean, the intersectionality is on so many different levels. So in one sense, it's methods, right? So you have gender and trauma that you bring together in terms of you bring Bible literature together. You borrow from psychology, sociology, literature studies, you know, so you do that. But then you also understand in terms of gender, the gender unit, which I sort of it's good to see of also Professor Eugene Kluter, who asked us, colleague Juliana, starting that for Lorna, I was very much involved also with this. But to start a gender unit, it's very much, we're looking about on what women at this time, sort of women's bodies, so on so many different levels violated. But we cannot not think also about race, class, sexual orientation, poverty. Everything comes together. So, you know, we need to talk about toxic masculinity construction. So, and for me, in the book, I also find so helpful womanist scholars in the United States who've really had to grapple with gender and race and class intersection in their own context. So some of the womenist scholars are very helpful, and also, you know, somebody like Toni Morrison, who has so profoundly influenced this book also, but also how she writes about gender and race and how that makes sense.
Yeah, I think not only your own biography, but your biography is also embedded in the South African context.
Yes.
And Amanda has already referred in her introduction, I mean, given the 16 days of activism. And interestingly, on the way, well, I had to wait about an hour and a half to get the car at the airport. It took nearly as long to get the car than flying from Johannesburg to Pretoria. So when I arrived actually 11:15, but when I got the car, it was nearly 1. And on the way, it was the Afrikaans news bulletin at Radio Sonder Grense, and then they had a discussion about the 60 days of activism. I just can't remember the name of the lady. She was introduced as an activist. She said she's actually so sick and tired of talking. Because everybody says yes, 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 government, NGOs, institutions, but nothing happens. Yeah. The problems just go on. And I mean, Amanda has already laid this connection with this, the fact that we are in these days of activism, and that your book actually, I think, is also a cry against what's happening. And I got a nice quotation from your book, where it says, and maybe then you can interact a bit with that, the right of a woman, but we can also add child, is a symbol for the violation of the land. The right of a woman is a symbol for the violation of the land. And that says a lot about the extreme violent character of our society.
See, and that's such a good point, and I think I want to maybe two things. First, before talking about the symbolic nature of the narratives, just saying that we have a wonderful media office at this university. So how I know it's sort of International Women's Day, 16-day activism, Women's Day. So how I remember this is because a week before, Alec Basson from the media office writes me and says, please write an article for the newspaper? And they said, I will write something. So, and that's the thing, for years we are writing about this. I'm writing, Amanda's writing, Louise is writing, Stella's writing, Lou Marie, Sandra, I mean, all of the first, I mean, we're all writing on this. I think I mentioned all my feminist friends here. But, so we are all writing. Sort of to say no, we teach it. So many of my colleagues wear buttons, Thursdays in black. And so, to remind her, it's to say no to gender-based violence, but nothing's changing. And we see this on my, we see it in terms of brutal rapes, but we just really tip off the iceberg. We see it in so many ways, the overt and covert forms of violence that so many women in the workplace, in houses, in churches, in everywhere have to endure. And I mean, and I know Amanda and so on saying, you're so sick and tired of it. We're tired of it, but we keep on writing, we keep on talking, we keep on. So we help, I think we gather and get new strength, and then we go and write again. So I think so that's on that. The symbolic nature is so interesting in the biblical text, and I make this point throughout the book. So many of these stories, personal stories, rape of Dinah, Ruth and or the Lot's daughters in Genesis 18, the 4 original handmaids. For those of you who don't know that the Handmaid's Tale comes from the biblical text. Leah, Rachel, Bella and Zilpah. The Bella and Zilpah was the handmaids. So all of those stories are really stories about people, what they've experienced, and the violation of so many different levels. Insidious trauma, ongoing, persistent, never-ending trauma. But it's also about a country, about people. So it's symbolic. It's a symbolic way of how the people of East Judah, after the Babylonian exile, in what they've experienced in terms of in the shadow of the empire, how they felt. We see this in Daughter Zion. It's a symbol. Runa talked about this almost. He works on this master study on a wonderful film, Mother, Darren Aronofsky. So we have this conversation also about this woman who experienced extreme violence in the house, the system of the earth. So it's again, it's the same thing, it's a symbolic story, but you show a story of a woman, but it sort of stands for something different. And I mean, even that, I mean, and I think that quote comes from also from Disgrace, you know, of how Jane Putsia also uses that, and I bring conversation with limitations. But the notion is that when you rape a woman, you rape a country. It's a stain on the country as a whole. And I think if we can't claim that, if one woman, one child suffers, we all suffer. We all, Denise Ackerman, who was also cited, Tanya, talks about that also in terms of HIV/AIDS, and I think we should make that case also in terms of rape and sexual violence. It's all of our problem. It's all of us are suffering if women and children are suffering.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you've, saying that, you've also touched on a very important perspective in trauma theory, namely the emphasis on either, on the one hand, individual versus the collective. And I have, it's not a quotation from your book, but we all know her very well from literature, Shelley Rambo, in an introduction to her book titled Post-Traumatic Public Theology, she states as follows: trauma is suffering that remains. And that, in a sense, I think leads to what you've just said. So, in a sense, according to her, this condensed definition formulates the core of a traumatic experience, namely the problem of integration. So, how do you adapt? How do you, it hinders your ability to incorporate, to integrate in a new framework of meaning after having experienced this trauma. And then the challenge in the aftermath is to orientate oneself again, to befriend the world again, and to restore trust and connections again. So, and I like this quote from Rambo: the post-traumatic is the challenging territory of this work of integration. So maybe you can just expand a little bit, because there are such a vast array of trauma theory and emphases, but you have specific conversation partners.
And that's such a beautiful quote. And I mean, so I come to mind, I also use quite a bit of the work of Bessel van der Kolk, and he has a beautiful book, The Body Keeps the Score, which exactly says that how trauma sits in your body, sits in your mind, changes your brain structure. If you've been traumatized, I mean, it happens, you are changed forever. And I mean, even to understand that for yourself and about others with whom, that people can't just get over it. I mean, it's difficult. And I mean, but what often happens, also the notion of the split self, the disintegration. You do not, so it often happens with women, do not have a sense of who they are, because they've been so bombarded with so many different ways of telling them they are bad, they are evil, they are wicked, violent. So violence to the core has been done. And then what stories does in terms of it reintegrate the traumatic narrative. And that's why, I mean, to retell the story, to say this terrible thing happened, but I'm okay. So you put it, the traumatic memory, which you don't even have words for, you put it into words, and you put it into a story, and you put it into a narrative form. And so that's the writing to survive. This is a beautiful term, scriptive therapy. Suzette Henke talks about that. So, and yes, so that is that many of us, we are writing to survive. But then on the other hand, that's also the beautiful thing, we're also reading to survive. Because while we read trauma narratives, we connect in a very existential way with it. I mean, it's this balance with Christopher that I referred to. He says for us in biblical texts, you can do it to other texts as well, but it's almost to lean over, to touch the shoulder of the biblical writers and ask, are you okay? And then the reality is they aren't okay. And so also not we at times. And I think that sort of linking, recognizing, even to speak about reproductive loss, how many women are not okay? And how do you talk to women who are not okay in terms of that? And then what I love, Julia Kristeva, she talks about literature as a counter-depressant. Literature, movies, and it lifts up. And she talks about this in the book Black Sun. And I mean, I think that sort of is not really not alone. I think it's sort of by literature, by films, by sort of reading together, one connects in a very meaningful way.
Yeah, I think many things in a certain sense with using this way of reading, this heuristic framework, if I can call it that way, to read texts. Many insights through the last decades or even longer come together. And we spoke today also about a famous German scholar, Rainer Albert, he wrote a lot, but one of the books he wrote was about the Babylonian exile. And I can still remember that very profoundly. One statement he made, had it not been for the exile, the Babylonian exile, we probably would not have had the Hebrew Bible. Because the intensity of this traumatic experience, losing everything that made their identity, that formed their identity, and what we read in Lamentations, people being killed, women being raped, people taken away. So this was the impetus for them to start the scribes, to start theologizing, to start writing, they had to reinterpret, totally reinterpret the concept of God. So they had to come to a new concept of God. And I think what you do yourself, but what they also did, is this re-narration, the scribalization, the scriptotherapy, as you call it. So telling stories reframe the trauma. And it brings, like David Carr calls his book, holy resilience.
But for me to add to that, absolutely, and I think it is not to justify the suffering. It's not to say, I mean, no woman needs to have to write a beautiful book on rape, you know, because it came out of a trauma. It should not. In some ways, like my colleague at where my first place where I taught at St. Norbert College, she was this creative writer. She was a poet. And she always said she will never reach quite excellence in her writing because she's very happy, you know, sort of. So she's not a tormented soul, and it's not like a soul with life, you know, who committed suicide or some other people. So she's actually just average, and it's kind of funny, but it's in some ways in there, you know, sort of, you know, it seems like great literature comes out of really dark trauma and all that. But so I think. So it's not to justify it. I think we all should just be happy and average, maybe. So, but the point is good literature too, good theologizing, good new ways of doing comes out of trauma. So I think that is the resilience out of that. So yes, so in each of the 5 chapters, I start with sort of trying to get the woman's voice in terms of that. So for the chapter on Lamentations, now the book of Lamentations, 5 chapters. 4 of the 5 chapters is written in acrostic, which would be each letter of the alphabet. So it starts with a different letter of the alphabet. So in Hebrew, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet.
A, B, C, D, E. So it's very creative. So
then what I try to do, just to illustrate, try to understand how does that work. Write a poem in 26 lines, each letter alphabet, and tell her story in doing that. And it was I was on sabbatical, I'm drinking coffee, so you have time to do things like that. No, it was so fun. It was in some sense, you know, there's also websites words that begin with X and words that begin with Z. So, you know, and you get these words and you make it, and it's sort of trying to move it to a point and everything. I mean, so it was again showed it to Crystal. I was like, I don't know, do you think it's any good? She was like, oh, this is kind of good. So I was like, okay, I'll put it in. But it was kind of, it was more for me, so therapeutic, because also why did these ancient writers write in the acrostic? Not because they were bored, but it was a way to bring order in the world that's in chaos. It is a way to use, because trauma theory, trauma breaks the links between the different hemispheres of your brain. So that you don't have words, the logic, now my son-in-law doctor is here, so that you don't have words to put your emotions. So there's a disconnect. So metaphors, language, literature is a way to reignite those connections between the brain in terms of that. So it's a way to, again, bring the feeling into words, because it uses both sides of the brain. And it might be, and it's a way to, again, make meaning, but a way to sort of put it in a story form. So for me, it was just, again, also a very creative, therapeutic exercise. I felt good after I wrote that book. And so I can imagine that's what the biblical authors, in some ways, also did.
And in the other chapters?
In the other chapters, yeah, so sort of also of Lot's daughters, rereading the story of incest, which is a horrible story, it's a text of terror, but rewriting it also as a trauma narrative, of thinking of what these daughters who have been so traumatized, seeing their whole city, Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed, but also just before that, the father giving them to the visitors who came to try to harm the guest, but he wanted to give the daughters a way to be raped. So just that trauma of what your father would do, then losing their fiancés in the carnage, sort of lose their life they have known. But I mean, so being so traumatized, and then their actions flowing from that. So it's just to reshift our narrative in terms of thinking about what they've experienced in terms of that. Yeah. In terms of the reproductive loss, also quotes from the book, very few words we have in the biblical text about what Rachel feel, give me children or I'll die. Rachel's cry. So try to keep a woman's voice amidst all the,
In a sense, it's also what Kathleen called the notebook on Jeremiah, of creating stories of how the people could have felt or what they thought. The text don't give.
Yeah, and it's kind of, feminists do that all the time. It's sort of imaginative filling in the gaps, and then people do more traditional scholarship tells us, this is just this, imaginative, like somebody said, sort of the diaries of Dinah or whatever, sort of type of thing. It's sort of very belligerent about what you're doing. But the point is, if there's no voice of what Dinah would have felt or would have said after being raped, but there's other rape victims who have said things, so you can imagine maybe what she would have felt, just trying to understand the story.
Julian, then a last remark question I have for today. You already indicate that in chapter 1, the introduction, but you actually work more on that in the conclusion. The whole link you make with the metaphor of jazz, and then you refer also to Toni Morrison, who says, jazz always keeps you on the edge. There is no final chord. There might be a long chord, but no final chord. There is always something else that you want from the music. So you use these thoughts for a metaphor for mitigating the severe effects of trauma on individuals and communities. So maybe you can just elaborate a little bit more on.
Yes, and Toni Morrison is just so profound. She uses this metaphor of jazz, also talk about trauma narratives. And what she says is that, sort of trying to, of course, coming to terms of trauma, it's not a linear process. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And then with post-traumatic, there's a trigger and you're right back in that moment of the trauma. So I think, she uses this notion of the jazz, of different voices, of different chords, of different speaking, and sort of in terms of thinking about creativity. It's a lot of these trauma narratives, improvising, a community, how you sort of make music together, how the different voices in the text, between authors, come to terms, a communal sense of making sense of drama. And the notion of complexity, because it is complex. Our lives are complex, literature is complex, and the trauma theorists, trauma authors, so amazing how they're bringing this ambiguity and contradictions into their narratives. They write it in. So I think that is something in there. And then also that the last word is never spoken. Also on this journey between the texts, it's open-ended. We continue having conversation. So it's so good to just continue having this conversation about what I find. But furthermore, how trauma theory develops and grows and our text.
Well, thank you very much. And once again, congratulations with this wonderful book. Big achievement.
Thank you so much.
Colleagues, we have some time in the program for questions and answers. So if you have something you want to ask a question about. It was fascinating. Thank you.
So what are we going to do with questions? Because the people won't ask and ask the question, should I take it from us? All the different things we have to think about now that we didn't have to think about before. Is it okay if I stand here and ask the question? Okay. So thank you, Julie. It's a wonderful privilege to be here. You are right from the start, you said, and a lot of us in the audience keep on writing about this. Amanda says she's keep on writing about this. And I sometimes I'm concerned that looks from the outside looking in that sometimes women struggle to make a concerted effort to protest because we're on the 60 days of activism. Do you think, regarding the content and the context that you wrote from, do you think there's one could be able to read a concerted type of effort from the women in the Bible to protest? Or is it so totally different that they just try and respond from their different situations? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, the women in the Bible, I mean, you really need to read between the lines and behind the scenes and out of the shadows. I mean, so probably also like women's history, like colleague Sandra's here. But I think, I mean, there's stories, if you read it in that way, sort of, there's some remarkable stories, which is kind of interesting. And for Lola, who just walked out, it's also a wonderful thing also on the daughters of Zelophehad, which is 5 daughters who rise up and to take on their father and also to inherit land. So there's a concerted effort of 5 women standing up and doing it together. I mean, sort of the complexity also in terms of between women in terms of the handmaid's tale. So sort of you have Rachel and Leah, sort of privileged, who have handmaids, servants, and which how in their struggles for the attention of a man in terms of also reproductive their efforts to get more baby wars, and also use their slaves in terms of that. And some of the women in Scottish show also that, I mean, read it also in terms of race, and also in terms of slavery in America. I mean, how often white women did not help, you know, sort of their slave servants in terms of that were sort of involved also with the suffering that some of their servants experience. So I mean, so there, and it's very complex now in the United States also, because I mean, in terms of Black Lives Matter, and a lot of African American women have so incredibly been hurt, also by their white sisters who were not there, who did not show up. So I think, I mean, you're constantly thinking about your own positionality. My stepdaughter Juliana was here, who just finished her master's in feminist philosophy, thinking really about the ally. And again, so helpful, Judith Butler, thinking about how we as white women can serve as an ally also in terms of that, and that we cross boundaries and break through divisions in order to stand together.
Sorry, I've got a question, Ron. Thank you. I was just wondering about your method a little bit. So if you, because I can imagine that you've got some narratives that's got a lot of historical weight behind it, because they're thousands of years old. And I've got other narratives that we think of as classics now, but they're like 20 years old. So did you have, could you bring them into dialogue, or did you have to read from one side to the other side? And then I can imagine, like, a practical problem would be that in the modern narratives, maybe a lot of them, there's some refraction because they pick up, they take those biblical narratives as a kind of a model for also speaking about trauma. So did that help, or was it in a way?
That's very interesting. So in terms of intertextuality, so these people sort of in terms of, again, it has to do with text production, of text reception. So I think that's our field. So text production will look at intertextuality and who influenced who, and sort of in the text, and, you know, sort of this So did Shakespeare read the Bible, and can sort of, so that sort of production. Text reception will be you as reader are forging these conversations. Right, so you bring this, you can't have just any conversation. You have to, there must be, like I tell my students, you can argue what you want, but you've got to be convincing. So you need to find a way in which there's a link. There must be something that sort of really, in terms of theme, in terms of character, in terms of, there must be a way into sort of that bring together. And you need to show, I think that dialogue goes both ways in terms of that, because I mean, sometimes the biblical narrative show things in the sort of the contemporary narrative that people haven't read. I mean, even reading Disgrace. I mean, I think really how we read Lamentations and what's happening there, and sort of the idea of the symbolization of a city and a woman who's the city that's entered, and sort of the violence against done to the city in terms of the symbol of a woman in terms of the city. Is helping us to read also what's happening in Disgrace in terms of that. But on the other hand, reading Light Between the Oceans and the beautiful, poignant expression of reproductive loss, the voices, I mean, there's nothing of that in the Bible. So that helps fold that in. And so I think it goes both ways. So, yeah, so it's about that.
We have a question from Naomi Rice. I'm interested in those passages that talk about traumatic events, but themselves are very violent or misogynistic or traumatic to read. Example, Ezekiel 23, which compares the destruction of Jerusalem to the downfall of two promiscuous women. How does understanding the trauma behind those passages help us to address them ethically?
A great question. Lamentations build onto that. There's a conversation also with what's happening in Jeremiah. Ezekiel actually goes back to Hosea, was the first one to use that. So what Devlina Gardner does in terms of Jeremiah, she says, I mean, even worse in chapter 13 of Jeremiah, it speaks about of Babylon being raped. Sort of God, and it's God lifting up the skirts. So God is the rapist. I mean, it's shocking, horrible language. And that continues also in Ezekiel, it's Israel, Judah, in Nineveh, and some of the other texts is the enemy. So which adds all that whole layer as well. So what Katrina kind of says, I mean, it's the rape language. It's shocking, and it is shocking because that's how they felt. I mean, even think if we experience a violation. I mean, it feels that's the type of, they feel raped, they feel violated, they feel penetrated. I mean, it's all language. We talk about city, but we use sexual language in terms of that. So she says it's, and even think about God as rapist. She says people need to make sense. They need to make meaning, and that's their coping strategy. So people use religion in all kinds of weird ways to cope. They have their coping mechanisms, strategies, narratives they create to make sense. Why did this happen? I deserve this. God is just punishing me. So some of that language. Now, what I would say is that some of those narratives are problematic because it further installs violence and it doesn't challenge the normalization of violence. So that is also what I try to do in my writing, but also my students to deconstruct, to challenge, to talk back. Don't desire also in the Book of Lamentations, talking back some of the constructions you've made of me. Say this is not true. That's your construction, but this is not who I am. This is not, so to be able to talk back.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Julie and Alphonso, and congratulations again. And thank you for being here. The snacks and wine will be outside on the porch. You're all welcome to enjoy. And please book us on the table.
You can ask somebody.